Much is happening in the world in general. Former chair of the Defence Select Committee, good friend of the show, Tobias Ellwood. Good afternoon, sir. How are you?
Good afternoon. I like the idea of you stepping into Parliament. I want to see that day one day.
What do you reckon?
Well, we need good people to step forward, but
I get into trouble. The right honourable gentleman's a tosser. I'd be in trouble within 5 minutes, Tobias. I'd be in real trouble, wouldn't I? There we go.
Well, there's plain speaking, but then there's also making sure that we have proper, robust debate. And I'm afraid that was absent to be able to discuss the very subjects that you and I talk about on a regular basis.
Tobias, I'm sort of today in a state of confusion/anger. Today, firstly, we heard that British Storm Shadow missiles are being allowed or have been allowed to be fired into Russia, deep into Russia. This was on the back of Biden announcing his support, eventually, of America doing that. Today, we discover that the Brits have allowed that to happen. Now, bearing in mind that the response from several of Putin's foreign ministry has been, this is escalation, bearing in mind that partners in Europe are preparing. Germany's revealed plans to mobilise its national defence. 800,000 NATO troops are getting ready. I find it utterly extraordinary that on that exact day, as we approach 1,000 days of the Ukraine war, this government thinks it's good, intelligent, switched on, sends a powerful message to not talk about that, but to talk about cutting 500 million more off the defence budget, cutting ships, drones and helicopters, right? Despite the fact that in their manifesto they promised to raise defence spending to 2.5 GDP. This is another blatant lie, Tobias Ellwood, isn't it?
Well, two separate stories there. Let's just divide those up. Firstly, what's happening on the battlefield. If we don't support our friends in Ukraine, Russia won't stop there. We've discussed this in the past. This isn't just about Ukraine. That's where the battle is. The greater war is an ideological war with Russia. So that's why it's important we support Ukraine. But we've left it very late in the day. This indecision of being spooked by Putin's rhetoric. It was firstly to do with the anti-tank weapons, then main battle tanks, F-16s, and now long-range missiles. And also, when did we get into this position of publicly declaring which weapon systems we may or may not see deployed on the battlefield? That is simply mad to share that with your enemy. You know, sharing your protocols with Russia so it can design its own battle plans around that. I'm pleased to learn that with the Storm Shadow has now been used. That decision should have been made months and months ago. We've been so hesitant for the 1,000 days that this war has been progressing. Now, separate to that then is this idea that somehow we should be spooked by the rhetoric that Putin uses. That's absolutely wrong. Take it seriously, absolutely right. But also work through the consequences were Putin to go nuclear. He would immediately alienate China and Russia, China and India, his closest security allies. And it would certainly unite NATO as well. And I promise you, America and Britain wouldn't stand idle by. I suggest that every F-35 that we own would be deployed to actually take out all Russian assets in Ukraine. There'd be huge consequences. So this is watching the escalatory ladder and not being spooked, not blinking every time Putin says, oh, you've done this, I'm now going to go nuclear.
I just find it extraordinary that the timing. I mean, most people, right, are concerned, and I think they have a right to be concerned. John Healey has just stood up, and you know about these things far more than me. Let me give you the list. 500 million defence cuts, 2 amphibious assault ships, HMS Albion, HMS Bulwark, a Type 23 frigate, HMS Northumberland, 2 tankers, a Watchkeeper drones, 14 Chinook helicopters, Tobias, and 17 Puma helicopters. Let me ask you a question. If you're decommissioning that stuff, why don't you give that stuff to Ukraine, who don't have that sort of equipment?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely right. That's a very good question. And I hope some of that stuff does make its way to Ukraine, who can deploy them in different ways, not necessarily in the way that they were designed to. You know, we watch with interest these announcements made in the chamber, because these are dangerous times. This is 1937 to the world right now. I have to say I'm not entirely surprised by some of these announcements. This is old kit. The Watchkeeper UAV has been replaced by Reaper and Predator. It was starting to crash regularly. It couldn't fly at night. It was obsolete. There's no point in keeping that going. The Puma helicopter, 50 years old, needs to be replaced. And HMS Northumberland, Type 23, that was first put to sea in the 90s. The Albion Bulwark good bits of kit. I'm sorry to see those. They've been mothballed for a while. The concern that you and I would share is that if this stuff is obsolete and technology moves very fast nowadays, you need to have the kit ready to replace it. They're still waiting for a medium lift helicopter contract to replace the Pumas. We're looking for those multi-role support ships. They won't come in until 2033 to replace the Albion and Bulwark. And we're now just down to 9 frigates. We are not ready for war.
Well, actually, I don't want to jump in because many serving officers, senior officers, and I thought Peter Cable made the point brilliantly earlier, have said that in the event of the war that so many people are worried about, Tobias, we wouldn't be ready and we wouldn't be prepared. Now that, you're more technical than me, but to me sat here, and the response from people has been incredible, is surely we need to ensure that we are prepared as a nation, which has led to the second argument this afternoon, which is at £500 million as a saving, on the back of the attack on farmers yesterday, which saves 565 million. You're not in government anymore, so you can answer this as you see it. We spent last year £13.5 billion on foreign aid. A lot of that Ukraine, but for other countries, including India, where we're sending millions of pounds to set up projects or whatever to a country that's richer than we are. My suggestion would be, if you knocked 4.25% off that foreign aid budget, you wouldn't have to make these defence cuts. And what I would say is, Tobias, that a lot of people listening and watching will not understand why we're helping other people and seemingly again in this country not helping ourselves. Don't understand it.
Yeah, I mean, you cover a lot of ground there. As I was about to say, the fact is that there has been complacency since the end of the last Cold War. It takes years to replace the bigger platform ships and so forth like that. And it isn't just this current government, it's previous governments as well. I'm afraid that we became too complacent, thinking there isn't a state threat anymore. There clearly is. Now, how you spend that money on, let's say, soft power, I'm afraid I disagree with you, because the projects with India, I'm not sure actually about that. I thought we'd stop giving money to India for the very reason that you actually point out. But there are other projects in Africa, such as that have been cut. When you remove support in Libya, for example, who goes in there instead? The Wagner Group. If you remove support in the Congo, who moves in there instead? It's China. So we then actually allow our adversaries to use their soft power or their coercive power to have a greater grip on these countries. And guess what's in the Democratic Republic of the Congo? All the rare earth minerals. That's why China wants to go there. So there's, I think, a wider understanding as to how well our overseas aid budget can actually be used. But I'll be the first one to say there are many examples where it's been poorly been used.
It's just, I think we'll find, and I just to finish want to say about Trump, right? I think we'll find that ideology is great. And I love to have you on because you've explained there in detail about those things abroad. But I think politicians need to understand that the average Joe, or Joanna, you have to say nowadays, don't you? They look at what's going on in this country, Tobias. They look at the basic things, the cost of fuel. They look at the lack of GP appointments. They look at what's happening when they're paying their bills and asking for nothing, and migrants and prisoners being released early to hotels. And they feel a sense of unfairness. When they see us giving money, you can label it for other countries to get involved, they're saying, well, shouldn't we actually be doing our best to ensure that we look after our own people? And I think America pointed that out very, very clearly to people 3 weeks ago. They're not interested in ideology. They're interested in a man who, strangely enough, resonates with people, despite how mad he is, by saying it's about gas prices for in your car, it's about food prices in your shop, and it's how actually Americans' livelihoods have been affected by migrants crossing the border. And it worked. And I would say this to all politicians of all sides. I think that's a feeling that's going to grow in this country, my friend.
It is, but it's also populism as well, I'm afraid. There's a little bit of that in there in order to get elected. Because where are these migrants actually coming from? Unless you put those fires out from where they're actually fleeing from, that will continue, no matter how many small boats you try and stop. Sudan is a great example, okay? It's recent. We recognize what's happened. The country has gone up in flames. There's a civil war. And I promise you, in about 6 months to a year's time, the numbers of people that will be coming from east of Africa, because the war in Sudan spreads in that part of the world, And yet now we can start to work out how we can actually bring calm and stability to that neck of the woods. If we don't, we will suffer the consequences. And on gas prices as well. Look what happens when those ships can't go around the Red Sea. So that's us having an interest in our security afar. If you want money for hospitals, for schools, for our policing, and even to tackle migration, we have to have an interest in our security abroad, because our economy, which is globally exposed, half of our GDP is affected by international headwinds, is connected to our security. And yet go back to that general election only a few months ago. How much did we discuss international security? It hardly was raised at all.
Absolutely.
And yet that is the critical piece of making sure that the Treasury has the money for all government departments. That's why we need to be saying more, and the public needs to be saying more, spend more, go up to 2.5% on defense spending, because that's what will then actually help our economy and our prosperity.
So good to have you on, Tobias. Really appreciate your time this afternoon. Tobias Ellwood, former chair of the Defence Select Committee.